Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm John Kasparian, the Interim Dean of Architecture, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first faculty presentation in our Noon Talk series, part of our fall lectures. We continue to have record numbers of attendees, over 300 registered today, so we're extremely glad to have you join us. In a way that we weren't able to if this were actually in person. So there are indeed some benefits to the situation we're in. I would like to again acknowledge the committee who organized these lectures, chaired by Assistant Professors Sarah Nichols and Brittany Udding, and the staff members, Christine Worley, and others who are helping implement them. As usual, following the lecture, a student member of the committee will conduct the questions and answers. A program note before moving on to today's speaker: Ilse and Heinrich Wolf, last week's speakers from South Africa, have graciously agreed to present the second half of their lecture at noon on Monday, the 26th of October, and we will send information out on that. And we hope you can join us for that. Also, all lectures are recorded and can be found on the RDA website. As you know, the theme of our series, Race, Social Justice, and Allyship, is not only intended to initiate a long overdue discussion about these topics in the school, but it's a very first step in our response to the ever more urgent concerns of our extended community, that we act decisively in implementing long-term change in the ways we recruit, educate, and foster future generations of architects. I've asked the faculty who will present these noon talks, there'll be two more, to address these issues in their own work, even though the original intent of these presentations was to provide the faculty with the opportunity to introduce themselves to a wider audience and share their interests to advance our common discussion in the school. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jesús Vassallo, whose lecture was canceled last year due to the COVID shutdown. A big difference since then is that he is now a tenured associate professor in the school and is to be congratulated on this achievement. Because of the nature, the introductory nature of these faculty talks, my own introduction will be brief. Jesús is unique in that he is both a practicing architect and a writer, with two extremely seminal books to his credit: the very recent and award-winning Epics in the Everyday and Seamless: Digital Collage and Dirty Realism in Contemporary Architecture. These are not only incredibly good books to read, but they're also beautifully presented. He is also an authority on tall timber construction and was recently awarded a huge grant from the US government that in fact is partially funding the design in the tall timber of the new wing of Hanson College. In addition to him using some of the funds for his tall timber class this semester, and it's my understanding that they'll be physically building something related to it. For those of you that saw these presentations in person last year, I did something out of fun, which was to Google each faculty's name. And I was really surprised this time, Googling Jesús's name, that it's not until about page 12 that another Jesús Vassallo appears, an Olympic swimmer in 1976. And there was some kind of scandal related to that. I I found that kind of interesting that Jesus's accomplishments would actually span those 12 pages. And indeed, it's my great pleasure, and I look forward to his presentation today. So please help me welcome, with your virtual applause, Jesús Vassallo.
Thank you very much, Gianna, for the generous introduction and for the opportunity to be here today and to share my work. I think it is always a special pleasure, but also a special challenge, I think, to present your work in your own institution. This is always, I think, a daunting task, and I think all the more so at Rice, where I'm sort of surrounded by such bright and accomplished peers and students. So thank you. When I was first invited to give a talk, like John was saying, I was planning initially to basically lecture on the last book that I've written, Epics in the Everyday, but then with the switch of the talk to the fall lecture series that has a sort of emphasis on race, social justice, and allyship, I thought, well, what part of my work actually is more connected to that topic? And so I decided to talk about the work that I've been doing the last few years on affordable housing in Houston. So first, I'd like to give you a little bit of context. As many of you know, I am from Madrid, Spain. So my previous experience with affordable housing was through the system of open competitions in Europe, in the European Union, where I'm registered. For instance, the image that I'm showing now is an image from the sort of winning entry that we produced for the 2016 European competition for the city of Munich. And I bring it up here because it's representative of the way that affordable housing is produced in Europe, where basically this is done through the municipalities that each of them has a sort of centralized housing authority that puts out usually competitions for designers, but also sort of developers and builders. And that basically where each of the cities has a very strong hand, is very centralized funding and very strong hand in directing the development of affordable housing. So that was basically the first thing I did when I arrived in Houston, in thinking about how to continue working on housing. I just cold called the director of the Houston Housing Authority. And as a sort of a slightly arrogant thing to do perhaps, but he was very nice. And he also informed me pretty quickly that the Houston Housing Authority is basically a voucher program. So that they do service in the realm of 60,000 families that each month get this sort of voucher, and then they can go and pay rent wherever they want. So basically they're subsidizing affordable housing that is produced by market development, but that they very rarely develop their own projects. So currently, I don't remember the exact number, but I think they own and operate something between 20 and 30 buildings in the city of Houston, city of 7 million inhabitants, so the total sort of, or 5 if you just think of the city. So compared to other cities that I know, European cities, that would be the number of buildings that they develop each year, not the totality of the buildings that they own and operate. So I was slightly disoriented and frustrated by that reality. I thought, well, if there is no competition system, if there's no housing authority, how do I even start to think about working on housing here? And then the second reality that was shocking to me is, and maybe this won't be so shocking to some of you in the public who are native to the US, was the actual segregation that is still imprinted in a lot of American cities. So what I'm showing up in the screen right now is an income distribution map of the city of Houston, and this sort of arrow-shaped or wedge-shaped dark blue area on the left of the screen, which is basically the higher income range in the map, overlaps almost directly with the parts of the city that are majority white, with the rest of the colors basically standing mostly for either majority Hispanic, majority African American, some small areas of Asian. But it was surprising to me not only to see that there's still a lot of actual concentration of ethnicities or segregation, however you want to call it, but also that it mapped to income in such a one-to-one way. Right? So just a little anecdote, when I first moved to Houston, my wife and I were looking for an apartment, and we just sort of typed in the rent that we thought we could afford, jotted down a series of addresses, and jumped in the car to go visit. And we very quickly realized that basically all the addresses that we had put down were west of Almeida Road. At the time, we were sort of staying in a short-term place very near Rice, which is west of Almeida Road, where most people are white. Then immediately as we crossed Almeida Road, most people were African American. And this was, for me, the first time that I experienced this reality of American cities. And really, it was a second moment of feeling sort of disoriented and feeling sort of ill-equipped to deal with these realities as a person, but also as an architect. So it took me a while, to be honest. It took me a couple of years to think about how to engage housing in my new context, in my new home. And I was lucky enough to have the example and the inspiration of the work that the Rice Building Workshop had done in collaboration with Preaccrual Houses, which is an arts nonprofit in the Third Ward neighborhood. A lot of you know this image, and a lot of you know this project, if not all. These are the duplexes at Preaccrual Houses, which came out of a series of experiments that Danny Samuels and Nonette Renee were doing at the time with Rice students, with the Rice Building Workshop. Eventually, after going through a couple of iterations as prototypes, were so successful that they started to be produced in larger numbers. And actually, at that point, Danny Samuels and John Casbarian had to take over with Taft Architects, with their firm, and actually Preaccrual Houses had to start its own separate nonprofit just to do these housing projects, which now number, I think there are approaching 30 of them in the neighborhood. So this was for me very inspiring, not only because these are very beautiful buildings and they're very attuned to the realities of affordable housing construction in Houston right now, but also because of how intelligently they inserted themselves in the reality of the community by collaborating with a local institution, with a local partner. So with that in mind, I started gradually shifting the emphasis of my housing studios. I've been teaching housing studies at the graduate level for the past 6 years. And I sort of influenced and inspired by this work, I started to shift the emphasis of these studios towards this idea of engaging each of the specific communities and try to meet them on their own ground and understand their realities. So the way we started working is that each semester with the students, we would approach a specific neighborhood. We would try and take a deep dive on the realities of this neighborhood. We would engage in conversation with the nonprofits that were trying to produce affordable housing and try to learn about their desires and the desires that they basically that they have discussed with the residents in their outreach efforts. Also, we try to learn from the challenges that they're facing in the actual implementation of these projects, and then we would use the studio as a think tank or a brainstorming exercise, basically, where the students would produce their own ideas as to how to produce a specific projects that would be somehow tailored to the needs of these communities and these nonprofits, NGOs that basically are on the ground trying to do the work. And I mean, it's been a really amazing learning process for me to learn how that actually works. It's a really granular system by which you don't have a big housing authority, but you do have a very rich tapestry of these very local institutions, CDCs, CRCs, but also sometimes just congregations and other types of nonprofits that have very deep roots in their neighborhoods and actually know very well what the neighborhood wants and what the neighborhood needs. But they are also small. They don't have they don't benefit from the economies of scale of larger organizations. So they do need all the help they can get. Like all nonprofits, they are understaffed, overworked, overextended in trying to produce and sort of supply a lot of the welfare functions that in many cases or in other places are centralized through the municipality. So one thing that I thought could be useful actually is, or rather what I realized when we showed the work of the studio to these organizations, is that they could actually use the architectural work, that they could actually use the help in producing these projects, because each time they want to do a housing project, they have to apply for a subsidy. And then again, this is a very rich and complicated landscape of subsidies, where some are federal level, but adjudicated through the state level. Some of them are directly given out by the state, some of them are city level. Sometimes it's a mix of federal funds that is distributed through the different layers of government, etc. So each time there's an application process, a competitive application process that is quite complex, where they have to put together a sort of site description, a pro forma, and a design package. And many times they lack the resources to do that. So I was trying to think how we could capitalize on the work of the studio to try and give some help and some service to these organizations when there was a call for a new grant at RISE. These are called, it was end of 2018, they call them the BRIDGE grants. BRIDGE stands for Building Research on Inequality and Diversity to Grow Equity. These were grants that were mostly directed to the social sciences and the humanities, but we managed to convince them that we as architects could also produce a sort of some added value and engage this type of work. What we did is we teamed up with people at the Kinder Institute and put together an interdisciplinary unit, basically research unit, with the objective of, again, sort of giving service and doing pro bono work for these nonprofit organizations that are trying to do housing and need all the help they can get. So you can see, up on the slide, basically that it's a pretty big team with Kyle Shelton at the Kinder and myself at sort of co-directors and then senior consultants. We were lucky enough that Danny Samuels was willing to serve and be part of the team and work with us, and he's been a great help. You know many of the other names, but more than anything, what the grant allowed us to do was to hire a group of students to actually work on these projects and take these projects on. And I want to emphasize here that the work that I'm going to show today, basically, even though it's a big group of people, 90% of the work has been done by our graduate students, Leon Lee, Brendan Carr, and Cohen Hudson. And I'm incredibly grateful to have their companionship, and also I feel extremely privileged to be working with them. It's been a great experience and really, really fulfilling to be able to do it this way. So again, 90% of the work means 90% of the credit goes to them. So after we put our team together, we engaged a series of organizations. Fifth Ward Community Redevelopment Corporation, as its name indicates, is based on the Fifth Ward, which is a historically Black community. Avenue, which is doing most of their work currently at the near north side neighborhood, which is majority Hispanic. And then Midtown Redevelopment Authority, Preaccrual Houses, and the Neighborhood Hub are three very different organizations, and they all operate for the most part in the Third Ward, which is the premier historical African-American community in the city of Houston. So all of them are outside of this blue wedge that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. So again, basically what we've tried to do is to figure out which funding opportunities they wanted to apply for, and then produce basically design to support them in their applications. So the first three that I'm going to show are for the Fifth Ward CRC, and they're based on ideas that came out of the studio that I taught in the spring of 2019, where we were looking at both Fifth Ward and near North Side, and we were trying to deal with what we were discussing as the lowest threshold of sort of multifamily development, and basically try to come up with what we call transitional typologies that would allow these small organizations to start to build up and transition from single family home development, which is what they've been able to do up to now, and sort of shift into multifamily, which is their future for the next decades, but to do it in a way that is really appropriate for their communities. Okay, so the first project is a part of what's called the small rental program. So this is federal money administered by the city of Houston. You can see on the left there's just white dot indicating the location in the city. And then on the right, a site plan where you can see our lot is basically 100 feet by 150, so 3 standard Houston city lots. And following from some of the ideas that came out of the studio, what we pursued was an approach where we tried to work with a very compact footprint building so that we could treat the whole site as a single reserve of land, but then position these structures, the dwellings themselves, being akin to, or as close as possible to a sort of single family development or small lot development. We decided to go for a party where we would have 2-story homes fronting the main road, and then that's followed by a band of pedestrian common space, shared space. Then there are 2 1-story homes that are accessible units. All of these federally funded projects have to have a percentage of accessible homes. And then there's another band at the back of the lot for the parking and the vehicular access. And here in this, on the left, you can see the sort of ground floor plan, and then on the right, second floor plan, and you can see a little bit where I was discussing, where we were trying to keep the footprint of the buildings very compact so that we could basically go for this sort of compound logic of this sort of cluster of small buildings that make up a small community and still leave enough open space in the ground level. As for the units themselves, the way that we thought about it was basically to try to maximize the efficiency of the layout. So the first 3 projects that I'm going to show are very similar in that the ground floor is for the most part open, and then kitchen entries, storage, staircases, they are sort of concentrated on a sort of denser band, and then that translates in the second floor in a arrangement of bedrooms where the whole effort is to avoid corridors and to avoid sort of waste of space, to be able to give every single possible square inch of space to the actual rooms in the house. So these are not micro homes; these are sort of respectable size homes. They would abide by market standards, but that takes an effort in just being super efficient with the layout. Very simple schematic elevations on the top, and then sections at the bottom, and then the accessible unit, single-story home. And you can see it follows the same logic to basically try and be very lean and very efficient. And then some images. This will be the project from across the road, sort of fronting the main street. Similar view, but this time looking north instead of south. The sort of pedestrian space between the units. And then some details, just looking at the buildings themselves, where we were trying to work with the vernacular of basically the clapboard cladding and metal roofs, white paint, plastic windows, and just basically having small sort of tweaks to the shape of the building and the arrangement of the building be what gives some architectural identity and some playfulness. And in this case, all we did was basically to just rotate the ridge beam sort of 45 degrees to get this sort of playful or sort of abstract profiles. Second project is an application for the same program. So basically it's the same scope of work. It's a different site, which is slightly different. It's a little bit farther out in the fifth ward towards the, it's as you can see on the right, it's an area that starts to be close to the highway and to sort of bigger pieces of land that are empty. This is a whole city block that is owned by the fifth ward, where they have an office building that they want to turn into a social condenser for the neighborhood. They're working on it. It's a sort of like the non-profit equivalent of a co-working space, basically, for the neighborhood. And then they asked us to produce a master plan to do rental housing and housing for sale. So what I'm going to show you today is the rental component, which is highlighted in a darker gray in the center of the plan. These are two axonometrics. So on the left, you can see how it has a more urban facade towards the office building, and then on the right, you can see how the north elevation is sort of more open, with houses opening up to their own private yards and to their own spaces for parking, etc. And this, in the end, we went for a solution that is based on the terraced housing. So similar to, we like to compare it to the terrace housing for workers housing in Philadelphia or some parts of London. There's again super compact in plan, very efficient in terms of giving the maximum amount and quality of space, but without many gestures. And the layouts, I think it's already sort of quite similar to what I explained before. These are different both in the sense that they have party walls on both sides, but also there's an outside porch at the ground floor that then basically supports a third bedroom at the second floor that becomes the master bedroom. And then the accessible units, again, they're 1-story. They're a little bit more inward looking, perhaps. There's like small patio homes, and then they benefit from double height space in the living room and the kitchen areas, because we basically match the height of the 2-story homes to be able to give them that sort of extra cubic feet. So maybe in this drawing where we can see the plan of the whole block is a little bit easier to understand, where we have 5 2-story homes in the center, and then this row is capped by 2 accessible 1-story homes at the ends that help shape and sort of give some limits to also to the back courtyards. So here you can see some images. This is the more urban elevation I was referring to, facing the bigger building, where each entrance is individuated with this volume, as well as each staircase. So we were trying to basically, within the unity of the whole, give just distinguish the singularity of each of the dwellings. And then as you turn around the corner, very simple side elevation, and then towards the back, this idea that the dwellings open towards their own yards with a series of porches, etc. And zooming into a little bit more this relationship of the dwelling to its own garden through the porch. So these 2 projects, we turned them in late June, if I remember correctly. And then the city of Houston is meant to announce the winners of that competitive process in the next 2 weeks. So we will know in 2 weeks if they have been awarded and they move forward or not. The third project is based on the same architectural premises, but it's a project that we did for a different sort of funding mechanism. So this was part of the affordable housing programs of the Harris Committee, which means it's outside of the city of Houston boundaries, but it's inside Harris County. And this is in the Crosby-Lynchburg Road. So you can see on the right, it's a big lot. On the left, it has a little bit of frontage to one of the main roads in the area. And then it's sort of limited on the right by a small bayou or tributary. So this is almost a rural setting. It's a mix between some parts really feel rural, some parts feel more exurban. But one thing that was nice about it was not only that it was sort of adjacent to a bayou, but also that only the front of the site had been developed, which meant that there was quite a bit of trees and natural sort of forest occurring. So we decided to work with that landscape and to try and leverage as much as possible. So the concept is similar to the first project that I showed you, where we have clusters of 2-story homes. Each of them congregate around a common yard, and then they are spaced out by 1-story homes that are the accessible units. And then there was a requirement for a very large detention pond, so we placed that closest to the bayou and tried and work with the landscape to basically produce a logic of layers, where there is a landscape of swales along the road, and then there's the landscape of the front yards, and then there's the landscape of the pre-existing forest that sort of is beyond and enveloping the houses themselves. Maybe it's a little bit easier to understand in this small axonometric. The houses themselves are similar. These are slightly larger, so these are three-bedroom homes, but the logic of the layout is the same. Open living below with very compact services, and then moving up, you have 2 to 3 bedrooms in this case, and two full baths. And then again, working with vernacular typologies and construction materials, trying to produce a sort of playful and sort of interesting, simple designs. here, section through the building, and then the one-story accessible units that are very, very reduced and sort of very archetypical. In this case, it's a big room type of approach where there's a shared living, kitchen, dining, and all the rooms open to this space directly. Then there's a side porch basically that gives basically direct access from any point in the dwelling. And then there are two smaller, more private porches both in the front and in the back. And just again, very simple elevations. What we were doing is we were playing with the scale of the cladding and the scale of the windows to basically give some personality to these buildings. This is something that where basically the windows in all of these projects, the windows are oversized, and the cladding, we're also working with the scale of the cladding to basically try and give these small buildings a sort of presence. Again, very simple sections, and then an image through the road and around it, these clusters of homes with the detention pond and the bayou beyond. This is an image that shows, I think, quite well this logic of layers that we were working with the architecture and the landscaping in this with this idea of layers. And you can see one of these shared yards, basically with 4 homes that share this front yard that gives access to each of them, and then each of the houses opens up towards the forest in different directions where they get more privacy. Again, a sort of common yard area, and then the back of the houses where they open up with bigger openings towards their own sort of more private yards. Okay, so that's the 3 first projects. Then I'm going to show just 2 more, and they are a little bit different in that they are not just affordable housing, but they are also sort of touch on arts, since they are artist housing projects. The first one is the deluxe cottages, which we did for the same partner, with the same partner, Fifth Ward CRC. We're sort of working on it as we speak. So here we're back to the Fifth Ward historical. This is off Lyons Avenue, which is the main artery of that neighborhood. And it's actually in the back of the Lux Theater, which is the cultural epicenter of this neighborhood. It's a historical theater that at one point was bought and refurbished by the Fifth Ward CRC. And it's now the center of their arts programming and cultural programming for the whole neighborhood. So they also own a pack of 15 cottages that are adjacent to the theater in the north. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is the Deluxe Theater. And then this property here is also owned by the CRC. 15 cottages. The cottage is basically the square equivalent of the shotgun house. It's the sort of same, it's a similar typology and same time frame, but it's instead of being a very elongated type with a single sort of row of rooms, this is a squarish and it has two rows of rooms that communicate to one another. This is the current layout, and then basically what we proposed is just the way we approach the project is what are the smallest interventions that we can do here to add some value to what is already in place and to improve the way that it connects to the different elements around it. And basically it's surrounded by a big parking lot that belongs to the theater to the right, another big parking lot to the left that belongs to a church. There's some single family housing to the north, and then the back of the theater itself with its loading docks and a small courtyard to the east. So what we proposed was very simple. We just made the biggest move that we did was to remove one of the cottages towards Oden Street to make room for a public plaza that would give more of a public front and entry to the project, but also provide a space for outdoor performance. Then we turned the building immediately adjacent to the plaza into a more public building. We added a side porch to reorient that building towards the square. And we retrofitted it we proposed to retrofit it as a sort of bodega or public house for the whole development. And then we just introduced a network of sidewalks and pedestrian connections and planting as a way to give some orientation and improve the way that, for instance, the way that the parking, the cottages and the theater relate to one another through these new sort of courtyard space. Similarly, in axonometric, the existing cottages, and then our proposal for this sort of small master plan, if you can call it that. So the idea is that out of these 15 cottages, one becomes the public building for all of them to do programming and sell their work and do events. And then the other 12 are artist live and work spaces. Out of these, 2 will be actually a residency program. So there will be 2 artists that will get to live in 2 of these buildings for free for a year. And in exchange of that, they will be expected to produce public art programming for the neighborhood. And then the remainder will be controlled rent for local artists in the community. So moving into the building themselves, this is the original layout of the cottages. I find this type of historical layout very interesting and actually very, very appealing. However, when we engage the artists in the neighborhood in a conversation as part of our input meetings and outreach efforts, we realized that it wouldn't work so well for a live-work arrangement because it's really difficult to navigate this type of layout without having to be constantly moving between the sort of living parts and the working parts of the dwelling. So in the end, we developed a series of layouts, and the ones that the community liked better were the ones where there was a more clear distinction between life and work. So you can see here how basically we took advantage of a load-bearing wall that supports the ridge beam in these historical buildings to basically divide a large continuous working space on the left and then the dwelling on the right. We also enlarged the front porch so that you could have direct access to either the work or the living part of the dwelling, basically to emphasize this independence. And then there's a sort of core, which in this case is located in the center, that subdivides the dwelling in the bedroom and living room, and also serves as a secondary connection. And this was something interesting that came out in our conversation with artists, is that they said, well, it would be really great if you could access the bathroom both from the workshop and the dwelling, because that way when a curator comes or a colleague comes or somebody comes, that they just come to see your work, but they need to use the bathroom. That way you don't need to let them into your house and see all your sort of, go through your more intimate parts of the dwelling. So we came out with this idea of like a Jack and Jill type of bathroom that also serves as a connection between the 2 spaces. And the other layout that we prepared is similar. We just pushed this sort of service core towards the north, where basically that gives you, instead of a 1-bedroom layout for the dwelling, it gives you a studio layout. And it also changes that the room that is connecting to the new back porch is now the kitchen. So it's basically it makes a little bit more sense from the standpoint of circulation and privacy, but otherwise similar. And then the advantage was that with this layout, if an artist is working in a medium that doesn't require such a strong separation, that it would be easy to produce a variance where there would be more communication between living and working. And then just very quickly, this is a schematic of the public house, where it has some front of house for events and selling artwork, and then a back of house to service and be able to basically have some small catering, small events, etc. Just some images here of this new square for public performance and gathering, and how we basically reoriented the public building with a new porch. Some views from the plaza looking into the project, and then across the plaza looking north. These commons, what we call the commons, these sort of long shared spaces in the north and south part of the site. The spaces between the cottages and the theater itself, and then the spaces between the cottages themselves as they are today, but also as they are sort of modified by our intervention. And then just some bigger sort of color images to get a little bit more into the actual spatial qualities of these spaces. So something that was important here was that we used the addition of the back porches as a way to also correct somehow the proportion of these spaces to make them more equivalent, because right now the way that existing units are oriented, they sort of have a bias that gave like some of these spaces were much better than others, and we were able to mitigate that by basically lining the existing dwellings with an additional porch in the back. Okay, and then the last project is a project that we're developing with Preaccrual Houses. So in the process of working with Danny, when he saw basically the work we were doing for this cottages project, he brought to our attention that some years ago they built a work yard at Preaccrual Houses as part, basically an open air workspace for the rice building workshop to be able to work on these projects at Preaccrual Houses, and that he wanted to propose that they converted, since it's no longer in use, that they converted to artist housing. So we very quickly got to work together, and sort of we're still in a very early process, but I wanted to share it today. So here in the dark gray, you can see the work yard and its location within the campus of Preaccrual Houses. So these are the original row houses and the sort of institutional building in the corner, and these are the duplexes, and this is the single mothers, etc. So an image of the workyard under construction. It's a very light, beautiful, lightweight metal construction. It has 4 bays, so it seemed just logical to say, okay, we're just gonna partially enclose the structure to produce 4 dwellings, basically, each per bay. So as you see it now, you can get a reading of the original grid of pillars, and then we organize it with a very simple banded logic where there is a continuous porch in the north, and then you enter with the big double doors to the work area of the studio. Then again, we're packing the sort of serving spaces, the kitchen and the staircase, the boiler, etc. The south of the southernmost band, and then moving up the stair, there's a mezzanine level that has a bedroom, sort of walk-in closet, and bathroom. And so perhaps it's sort of easier to understand here with the section where you can see how we're using clerestory windows and to take advantage of the double height space, and to basically have everything be more or less continuous with the kitchen and the closet being the only parts that are more sort of enclosed for practical reasons. And then we just tried to work with a simple logic for the elevations, where we would add to the existing layers of the building with our own sort of small variations. And so this is the north elevation with the deeper porch, then the side elevation that is more blank, and then the south elevation with the sort of access to the kitchens, etc. So some images, and I really like this image, sort of brings us full circle to the beginning of the presentation, where I just really feel that is so for me so special to be able to try and contribute our own small contribution to these very, very special projects. You see the duplexes on the right, and then the sort of reimagined work yard with the live work units for artists on the left. This is a view from across the road into that sort of porch space, and then getting closer, a better look at that, and sort of again the rhyming with the existing duplexes. And as you turn to start to see a little bit of the southern facade, and then again the north facade with the porch, and sort of to get a sense of how it sits within the master plan for Preaccrual Houses. So those are the projects that we've done, those 5 projects we've done between March and August, and which I think is a very good crop of projects. We're very happy with the results. What are the next steps for us? I think the one ambition that we have is that we want to engage our colleagues at the Kinder Institute more, and to be more adventurous and more experimental in the research phases for each of these projects. I think we've been very inventive with the design, and we've been very privileged to be able to work with sociologists, both in facilitating community outreach, but also in looking at data, etc. But I think there's more we can do if we work together more intensely. So that's one ambition. The second ambition is to scale up to multifamily. So there was an emphasis on smaller scale that came out of the studio that we taught in 2019, but we're already engaging in more medium scales and larger scales. We have two projects that we're starting right now that are already sort of much larger. And then also an emphasis on public space and social infrastructure. And this is something that I have always believed myself, but sort of being proven in practice, that you cannot really separate the work on housing from issues of public space and social infrastructure. Those two have to go together, because if you don't basically contribute a little bit of quality public space and social infrastructure with each housing project, you cannot expect the city to come back and basically just produce it for you afterwards, just completely disengage from the housing component. So that's, I think, what lies ahead of us for this year, for this next academic year. And then I just wanted to finish by making a mention to the reading that I recommended. So as you will know, they asked each of the presenters in this lecture series to give some readings in advance. I chose to propose In Defense of Housing by Peter Marcuse. And I did so because I think, I mean, it's a really, really amazing, smart book about the structural problems affecting housing in today. I chose to recommend this reading because in my mind it has a really smart balance. First of all, it explains very clearly how the housing crisis is not an anomaly, it's not actually a crisis even. The housing crisis is just a direct outcome of the logic of the production of housing today. So once you declare housing a commodity, it just follows that the system is gonna create this series of inequities. The book is pretty much an overtly Marxist criticism of the commodification of housing. And the reason why I chose it is because it touches on issues of race and inequality and into the granularity and specificities of different communities in Europe and the US, but it keeps a main focus on the structural and systemic reasons for how basically inequality is produced in housing. So, and I think I like especially that it keeps a good balance between issues of race and social justice, and then a wider focus on that is more universalist, so to speak. And I just want to say this because I think it's important, I think, for each of us to situate ourselves. And I think there are some limits to the way that we're looking at issues of social justice and sort of race right now. And it's important, I think, in my mind to keep always the bigger picture in mind. So I think that's all that I wanted to share today. Maybe just one last comment. If I were to perhaps reflect a little bit on these projects now that we've sort of had the opportunity to put together this presentation and look at them, I think that what we were intending to do and what I think we have accomplished to a certain degree is to match the somehow the restraint and the economy of means that is necessary when you are engaging with this type of housing, where you have to really hit very low price points and you have to be very, very conscious of your use of materials, etc. That we were somehow able to match that type of restraint and ethos of being very lean in the way that we work. That somehow I think that the ethos of the design, if I'm allowed to say so, if there's any virtue in it, is that it's basically similarly restrained and lean and sort of to the point. Okay, so that's all. I will be very happy, and I hope we have time to have some questions and talk a bit more.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation, Jesus. So now we'll move on to the Q&A questions. So the first question is from Stacy Ann Escario Niguez. She said, beautiful representations and documentations. And she asked, is there any concern for flooding in this area of Houston or rising waters? And how has that affected your design approach? Are there also passive and sustainable measures you are able to include in affordable housing? Any benefits of the harnessing the humidity or lower utility bills?
So none of these properties are in the floodplain. So Houston does flood a lot, but none of these are in areas that are actually more prone to flooding. Usually that's a requirement. If the government is going to give you money to do affordable housing, they ask you that you have to stay away from areas that flood. And if you start to get close to those areas, you start to have to build with a series of mitigation techniques. We did not have to do that because the sites were not prone to flooding. And then the second question, these, again, if the federal government or if public money is going into a housing project, they're going to ask you to be sustainable to a certain degree. So you have to, in the case of these projects, you have to, at the end of the day, guarantee that it's either going to be Energy Star certified or LEED certified. Basically, you're going to have some level of certification. So that's, and that's, we just achieve that through simple means like orientation and amount of openings, rate of insulation, etc. You also have to provide the possibility for these projects to add solar energy later on if the owner so desires, but it's not required that you install it from the beginning. My experience with affordable housing is that the less technology you put on it, the better, because the main challenge of affordable housing is not to build it, is to maintain it. It's really hard to figure out the economics of how to maintain affordable housing. So the less technology has to be maintained and upkept, the better. And I try to argue for that with the people that we engage.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is from Patrick Dario. He said, Jesus, it's good to see you and thank you for sharing these projects. It's quite remarkable to see these projects, but especially in that there's such an emphasis on the social components of the shared landscapes. My question is, how do you propose this kind of model to affordable housing developers who are often driven to create the most units possible? There is a potential for more density on each of these sites you show, but these designs suggest that more density is not necessarily the best approach. Can you speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. And I know that you're very familiar with this type of work through your own work in New Orleans. So it's an easy question in a way, or at least I'm sure you have your own answer. Yeah, so I think we really try to emphasize a shares of common space and shared space, and that's sort of ties into what I was saying before, that the generation of some social infrastructure and some public space is always a main objective of these projects. I think it's something that we can still improve a lot, to be honest. So for instance, we need to find a landscape developer, a landscape architect who is willing to help us and work pro bono with us in these projects because they're a little bit lacking in the development of landscape. So the ones where we've been able to do that, I think, are better. And then as for the issue of density, I think really the housing stock of a city is like the city itself, right? Like it needs diversity to thrive, right? There's not a one solution that fits all needs for any given community. And it's very important, I think, for the building stock of a city and housing stock to be diversified, both in terms of scales and different ranges of density, etc. In the work that I presented today, we were focusing on the very small scale and sort of lower density, but I think the other sort of parts of the spectrum of density are also necessary, and there are also ways to do them sort of with just trying to tune into the realities of the place. I think these type of projects are necessary in the sense that Houston is primarily a single-family home. So when the city was built, it was just blanketed with single-family homes. It's hard to just go straight to apartment buildings that are in the hundreds of units that are multi-block or multi-building. I think there is a need for intermediate scales, and these projects are already sort of doubling or tripling the density in their or pre-existing density. So they are already like a second generation, and I think we need all the tools in our toolbox to make cities work and to deal with the lack of housing. So.
Okay, thank you, Jesus. Next question from Lei Pfeiffer. He said, beautiful exhibits and presentation. Have California bungalow court housing and other historic passive housing types influenced your thoughts on contextualism and density and scale? How have you found your activism has produced the most friction in reviewing committees? And also, how have they best stitched the fracture of these sites? Thank you again.
So it's a great question. So I am aware of the West Coast bungalow court typology. There is a movement, or there's rather an architect who is arguing for a movement that he describes as missing middle housing, where it's a similar argument to what I was just describing, where you have single family homes in the suburbs, you have big buildings at the core of the cities, but basically we've polarized the building stock to those typologies and we're missing everything in the middle. And what he proposes is to go back to historical typologies like the duplex, the triplex, the quadruplex, the bungalow court, etc., in order to be able to fill in the gaps and provide different living options and different arrangements. I think it's a good argument to make. There are 2 points only. I think the way that it's phrased or used in West Coast discourse, it's a slightly conservative argument about historic architecture and historic community. So I think our approach is a little bit different in that I think we're a little bit less sort of conservative in that way, or a little bit more free in the way that we use historic typologies. And then most importantly is that we're not looking exactly at the bungalow courts, because we already have native typologies in Houston that are very rich, like the cottages and the shotguns that have their own way that they cluster together, their own way that they create public spaces and address a very particular way that there's a relationship to the cities, of the buildings to the street and the sidewalk, and then also the sort of shared backyards, etc. So we're working in a very similar spectrum with these projects that I showed today, but I think we're a little bit more aggressive in pushing the design, and also that the precedents that we're working with are native precedents, local precedents. And then there was a second part of the question about activism. I don't know, could you please repeat that part?
Yes. So he said, how have you found your activism has produced the most friction in reviewing committees? And how have they best stitched the fracture of these sites?
I wouldn't say that what we do is activism. That's a little bit the point I was trying to make with Peter Marcus reading. Our clients are the real activists, and they are the real, I mean, these organizations, they are the real deal. You know, they really are the ones who advocate and who mobilize and who give sort of public comment and who organize. And I think we just share in their aims and we try to serve them. So I don't think what we're doing is necessarily polemic from a review board standpoint. I think we try to push for less parking, but we're always taking we think that we can contribute as architects. So what we try to argue are points about planning regulations, and our points about they are a little bit more technical. But I wouldn't dare to call myself an activist, to be honest. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you, Jesus. Next question is from friend Kelly. He asked, how do the locations and the nature of these developments relate to public transit, essential services such as retail and education facilities? These are also critical to affordable housing. How are other public city entities involved in planning or developing these sorts of housing?
It's a very big question. I don't know that I have time to answer it, but so none of these are transit-driven developments. None of the ones that I showed today are directly linked to or considered as transit developments. The projects that we're starting to work on now that are a little bit bigger, some of them are tied to transit. They're a little bit, that's a slightly different animal. And then of course transportation, education, healthcare, access to food, like all of these are pieces to create a healthy community and a healthy city, right? And there are many, many institutions, and there are many, many different parts of the city, both from the both inside government and on the side of nonprofits and NGOs that are working on this. So I don't think I have time to describe what the ecosystem is Houston, but maybe I will just say that we just try again, focus on what we know, and try to contribute what we know, which is a little or a lot, but it is what it is, basically.
Next question is from Callan McNamara. She said, very exciting to see. Thank you so much, Jesus. There is a certain austerity to the rendering style. Could you talk a bit about representation and audience for these public housing projects?
It's an excellent question. I really appreciate it. So the way we were thinking about it was that we were designing again for this super economic. I mean, really the pressure on the performance of these projects is huge, right? So they're really low. I mean, they're really lean in a way, and you have to go at it with that sort of mindset. So somehow, even the way that we've worked through the projects has been similar, has been trying to resonate with that. So there have been no physical models. We've done everything. Of course, with the virus, we had to work remotely, so we've been just sort of working on files on a server, just doing 3D models, and then at the very end, just producing renders that try to be very much to the point, right? So without too much spectacle or embellishment. And we were trying, and that's just the sort of the way that we were thinking about it beforehand. Then what has resulted, I think, are images that are perhaps a little bit austere for to take them to community meetings and for public comment. Perhaps a little bit too simple for publication, but that we think they have an honesty to them. Like these projects, if they are going to be built, they're going to be built around $100 per square foot, and I think there's something like ethically wrong about either trying to produce an image that produces basically or that it raises expectations to a point where you cannot fulfill them. And then on the other hand, I also think that it has to be a type of representation that is accessible to people in a public audience. So we were trying to strike a balance. I don't know if we achieved it or not. Maybe they are too austere. And that's just the way that we like them. But I'm just trying to give an honest answer.
So another question coming from Brittany. She asked, can you please talk more about your studio's design process and outreach with these different organizations in Houston?
So we choose a neighborhood, and then we also try to insert ourselves. So we do two things. We try to insert ourselves in the existing planning efforts, basically. So, for instance, for the past few years, we've been working with the different plans for the complete communities plan that was sort of the brainchild of Major Sylvester Turner, where he chose several of these majority-minority communities that had been left behind and made these sort of rigorous studies of what they needed and what needed to happen for these communities to catch up. And so these are planning documents that exist, that are out there, and that are being used by both the city and non-governmental entities to work in these neighborhoods, and they have a housing component already. And then there are planning efforts by the city itself, different things that are happening at the city level. So that's one thing. We try to understand all the different layers of existing sort of planning and regulation, including building codes, etc. And then we go and talk to the people who are actually trying to develop affordable housing and applying for subsidies. And we just try to figure out two things: like what are their ambitions and goals, and then what are the obstacles that they're finding in fulfilling those ambitions. So, and then after that, it really framed as an open process where each student or group of students produces a prototype that basically tries to produce an answer to that open question. So the studios produce an array of work with a range of scales, a range of approaches. Some of them are more radical in producing different living arrangements for different types of families. Some of them are more conventional in the layout of the units, but more revolutionary in the clustering or in the sort of public space component, etc. So that's really up to each of the students. And what I showed today is a little bit different because it's, once that studio is over, we just take a few ideas that resonate with the nonprofit developers in the area, and we try to produce projects that are more targeted. So what I showed today was sort of much more narrow in focus than the studios are really like a much more open brainstorming exercise. And what we do always try to do is we try to cover a range of scales, basically, to address this issue of the missing typologies in the middle of the spectrum.
Thank you. So we have a lot more questions in the list, but we are running out of time. So this is one last question from an anonymous attendee. He or she asks, in many of the areas your project are located, one of the problems is the lack of commercial infrastructure that supports the residential. Providing the housing solves one problem, but continues to promote a landscape of car-oriented development rather than walkable neighborhoods. Are your future projects going to look at small, mid-scale mixed-use programming or other program topologies that solve this issue?
Yes. Well, the answer is yes. I mean, we're already doing that to some extent with I think the Deluxe Cottages project, which is the one project in this group where we had more freedom, because it's a project that is going to be funded through foundation money, so it doesn't have to go by the set of rules of either state funding or federal funding. So we could actually include sort of some degree of tertiary, and I think this is something, as I said, one of our ambitions for the next round of projects is to include more social infrastructure in that shape.
Thank you, Jesus, so much for answering these questions.
My pleasure. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you for your patience.
Yes, thank you again, Jesus, for your talk and sharing your work on the Affordable Housing Lab. A virtual round of applause is called for. And to our audience, thank you all for tuning in. And please join us next week for our first evening lecture. You are standing on occupied land with Anna Maria Leon. Thank you, everyone.